Hey y'all, what is going on? What is going on? It's your girl, Melba Pearson, Melba from Miami, Melba for Justice, also known as the Resident Legal Diva. And it is time for another Mondays with Melba. Super excited to have my friend Elizabeth Kelley on with me today to talk about her newest book and all things mental health and the law. So, Elizabeth, welcome to Mondays with Melba, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Melba.
So let's get into it. And of course, it is my pleasure. So, can you share a little bit about your background and what sort of brought you to this area of law and why you're so passionate about it?
Sure, happy to do that. I am a criminal defense lawyer and I focus on representing people with mental disabilities. Mental disabilities is my global term for people with mental illness like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, major depression, as well as intellectual and developmental disabilities, conditions like autism spectrum disorder, what we used to call mental retardation, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD. And the American Bar Association has just published my fifth book, the second edition of Representing People with Mental Disabilities, a practical guide for criminal defense lawyers. And although the audience is criminal defense lawyers, this provides useful information for families as well as judges, prosecutors, and probation officers. In other words, I take what are sometimes very difficult concepts and I try and make them accessible to a wide audience.
So that's super helpful. Can you share a little bit about why more people seem to be interested in that intersection between disability and crime lately? Because I just don't feel like it was a discussion like, when we were kind of coming up through, because we're in the same, age range, right? So, when we were kind of coming up, that wasn't really a discussion so much in the legal field. It didn't feel like to me. So, what do you think changed?
I think one of the things that changed is over the years, people became more sensitive to the fact that probably half the people in our jails and prisons have some sort of mental issue. And if they didn't have one going into the criminal legal system, they certainly did after surviving and enduring the process and probably after incarceration. That being said, with the pandemic, people became a lot more in tune with the fact that, yeah, people have a variety of different mental issues, whether they are diagnosed or not. And certainly over the years, people have tried to come up with ways to divert people with mental disabilities out of the criminal legal system, which is why more and more you have seen various alternatives like mental health courts, veterans courts, drug courts. So it's a big confluence of recognition.
And what do you think is one of the key misconceptions around mental illness or disability that you'd want to dispel right now? Because I know there's definitely a bunch, but what would be the biggest one that you're like, people get this wrong all the time and they need to know that that's not the case?
Well, it's not so much that they get it wrong, but I want to underscore that mental disabilities do matter. If someone has a mental disability, there is most probably what I call a nexus between that disability and the conduct that is charged. And in turn, lawyers need to be sensitive to that in terms of ordering a mental health evaluation, knowing that if their client does not meet the standard of incompetent to proceed or insane at the time of the act, they can and they still should use that mental disability when they are working with the prosecutor to negotiate a plea, and certainly when standing before a judge at the time of sentencing to mitigate whatever penalty might be imposed. And if, God forbid, that client should be sentenced to jail or prison, probably because of some mandatory sentencing scheme, to advocate for the proper type of accommodation. It's easier in some courts versus other courts. It all depends upon the nature of the charges. So, as you can imagine, it is much more, it is easier to argue for accommodations and mitigation if the client is charged with a low-level misdemeanor versus a serious felony. It differs based on the client's previous criminal record, if any. So 1,000 different things go into the equation. But at bottom, I want to make sure that the mental disability matters and is taken into account.
So when you say accommodations, what do you mean? Like what is the universe of accommodations that can help somebody who is struggling with mental disability or mental illness when they go into the jail or prison system, or is there something else that I'm not thinking of, like in probation or something like that?
Well, even before that, depending upon the nature of the disability, the client could require, indeed benefit from, certain kinds of accommodations. For instance, it could be something so simple as the way the lawyer interacts with the client,
Mhm.
the kinds of questions that are asked, and then moving on to the courtroom. It could very well be that if, for instance, the client has dementia, there are
Mhm.
certain times of the day where the client just cannot function. If the client has a mental illness and is on medication, it could very well be that when the meds are starting to wear off, the client is not at his or her most aware. If the client is sentenced to jail or prison, it could be that depending upon the different resources within the state, there is a specific facility
Mhm.
that is more appropriate for that client. So, for instance, in the state of Pennsylvania, there is one particular facility, Albion, that has a special unit appropriate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. In the federal system, there is a special program called the Skills Program that is available at the Federal Correctional Institution at Danbury, Connecticut, as well as Coleman in your state of Florida.
Mhm.
And this is a special type of program that basically introduces people with intellectual and developmental disabilities like autism to the federal system and helps them navigate their way through a prison sentence. Because unfortunately, there are a lot of unwritten rules when it comes to survival in prison. And in particular, people on the autism spectrum don't understand those unwritten rules. And this type of program can help them. But Melba, at bottom, jail and prison is the worst place in the
Yeah.
world
Yeah.
for people with mental disabilities. And if they've committed a violent crime, if they've committed a serious crime, I'm not trying to make excuses for that. What I am doing is saying that there is a reason why they committed that. And it may very well be that the lawyer working with the family can access other resources in the community that can ensure that that individual does not pose a danger to themselves or to the community.
And so, just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying before, in terms of, you're not trying to minimize or dismiss the harm that may be, caused by a person suffering with mental illness. I feel like there's a huge swath of space between insanity, right? That legal definition that means you do not understand right from wrong at the moment that you committed the crime, to committing a crime, but you have a mental illness, but you're not necessarily meeting the legal definition of insanity. How are you able to explain sort of that distinction to folks, right? And sort of like, I wouldn't say that, just centering sort of their humanness, and the fact that just because they didn't meet that definition doesn't mean they didn't need help or didn't fully grasp what
Yeah,
they were doing at the
you've
time, right?
you've touched on a bunch of different issues, Melba, and I hope I give justice to them. First of all, the standard for insanity in the legal system is a really, really high one. Contrary to popular belief, defendants across the country are not entering pleas of not guilty by reason of insanity all over the place. And contrary to popular belief, defendants are not getting off on technicalities because of insanity. For any of your listeners who remember John Hinckley, the
Mhm.
guy who was found not guilty by reason of insanity for his attempted assassination of President Reagan, after he was found not guilty by reason of insanity, insanity statutes throughout the country were tightened,
Mm,
and it put the burden on the defendant to prove by clear and convincing evidence, which is a pretty high standard, that they were acting under the color of insanity at the time of the act. That being said, the legal definition of insanity does not match the medical definition. And in
mm,
fact, there's no such thing as a medical definition of insanity. Complicating matters even more is the fact that insanity is a misnomer when it comes to people, for instance, who have dementia, who are charged with a crime, or people on the autism spectrum, or people with an intellectual disability. Insanity only is remotely appropriate to the people who were most floridly psychotic at the time of the act. All of that being said, to one of your last points, someone has a bunch of different mental issues, but they don't meet that narrow legal standard. What's to be done?
yeah.
You can always use evidence of a mental disability or a constellation of mental disabilities to try and argue for a lower plea, to argue for a more appropriate disposition of the case, like transferring it to a mental health court docket. You can use it to argue for special resources within the community. At the risk of sounding like a broken record, make the mental disability matter, because it does.
Yeah. And so, you talked a little bit about your second edition and how you really want attorneys to come away with the fact that, ask for that evaluation, push for your client and highlight the fact that they have this disability that may result in them needing something different. But you've also added resources for families and community members through your website as well as your writings. Can you share a little bit more about that, and how can folks find out more information? Because I'm thinking about the folks that struggle with mental illness in their family, and they just suffer in silence. Like they don't really know where to go for resources, or they think they just have to suffer in shame, or worse yet, they're going down the path of Dr. Google that never tells you anything good. So, like, what are your thoughts on where folks can get like accurate resources and empower themselves to be able to help their loved ones?
No, thank you. Thank you for that question. Quite frankly, I hope a prosecutor or a judge picks up the book. And I hope that they have a few takeaways. First of all, that the mental disability is not an excuse, but it explains the conduct. And also that people with mental disabilities are just different. They're wired different. Their brains function differently. They behave differently. And because of that, they are particularly vulnerable to getting ensnared by the criminal legal system. And as such, consideration needs to be taken. It must be taken. That being said, where do you go for resources? There are some wonderful nonprofits. Some are particular to communities. Some are nationwide, like NAMI, the National Association for Mental Illness. It has a chapter in virtually every state, and in some of the larger states, it has, like Texas, it has chapters in individual cities or regions of the state. There's also a wonderful organization called the ARC, and that is the oldest advocacy organization for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And in particular, they have a program called the NCCJD, the National Council on Criminal Justice and Disability, that provides resources not only for criminal defense lawyers, but also for prosecutors, and more importantly, training for law enforcement. It teaches them how to handle the particular circumstances of individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, things to do and things not to do in order to avoid escalating a situation. And beyond that, as you said, there's a wealth of information online, but it's always the buyer beware. You should look at who is authoring the site. And also, quite frankly, you should look at the date of the information, because this field is rapidly developing, and there are always new initiatives. Some initiatives, like autism courts, which may be applicable to your jurisdiction, and is something that your court may want to develop on its own.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so for everyone watching, just know I'm going to drop the links to those websites that Elizabeth mentioned in the comments. So that way you can get that information very easily and you don't have to worry about trying to Google it and find it. Elizabeth, final words. How can folks find you? How can folks reach out to you if they want to retain you, or at least run a scenario by you in terms of they have a loved one with mental illness that may be facing charges or something along those lines?
Sure, I'm always happy to brainstorm with families, as well as any interested attorneys out there. My website is www.elizabethkelleylaw.com. That's Elizabeth with a Z, and Kelley is spelled Kelley. I am very active on LinkedIn, as well as Twitter and Instagram.
Awesome. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me on Mondays with Melba. I'm definitely going to make sure that there's a link to your book as well so that folks can hop on over to the ABA website and get a copy. Definitely would suggest all of my legal practitioners watching out there that you take a peek because Elizabeth has a wealth of knowledge that, hey, if it's one strategy that you come away with that can help your clients, I mean, that times 10 pays for the price of the book. So definitely check it out. And again, Elizabeth, thank you for joining. And I will see all of you next week. Take good care. Bye.